The smell hits you before you reach the door. It's sweet in a way that has no right to be sweet, thick and low, clinging to the morning air like something the night left behind and forgot to take with it. You've been a physician long enough to know the difference between the smell of sickness and the smell of death. And this is neither. This is something else. Something you don't have a word for yet, though by the end of the year you will have smelled it so many times that you'll recognize it from the end of a street, the way a butcher knows what's in the back room before he opens the door. You ring your bell once, twice. Nobody answers. You push the door open yourself. Inside, a man is sitting upright in a chair by the hearth as though he simply fell asleep there, except that his neck is wrong and his left hand has fallen open in his lap, and the skin along his jaw and throat has gone the color of an old bruise, dark, almost black, in patches. On the table beside him sits a cup of wine, still half full, a loaf of bread, partially torn. Whatever killed him, it was not slow enough to let him finish breakfast. You are 31 years old. You are a trained physician, educated at Montpellier, which means you have spent the better part of a decade studying the greatest medical minds in human history. You know Galen. You can read urine, balance humors, time a bloodletting to the position of the moon. By every measure available to you and everyone around you, you know exactly what you are doing. You stand in this doorway in the summer of 1348, looking at the dead man in the chair, and you understand, with a cold, specific clarity, that you have absolutely no idea what you're dealing with. The reports had been arriving for months before the plague itself did. Ships from the Black Sea, sailors coming into Marseille with swellings packed into their armpits and groins, men who were talking and walking at dawn and dead by nightfall, their skin darkening in patches as though something was burning them from the inside. The disease moved west from the ports with the particular efficiency of something that doesn't need a road. By the time the municipal council sits you down and slides a contract across the table, a salary, guaranteed housing, their solemn promise to care for your family should you die, which everyone in the room understands is less a formality than a reasonable forecast. The plague is already consuming Avignon, 40 miles north, where the Pope lives. Which means if God was selecting somewhere to protect, he appears to have started with a different list. You sign the contract, not because you are brave, necessarily, because you have rent. What the contract does not mention, and what you will understand within the first 2 weeks, is that you are also being hired partly because the physicians who had better options have already taken them. The more established doctors in the region had seen what was coming from the coast and made arrangements. Family in the countryside, prior obligations in other towns, urgent business that materialized with suspicious speed. What's left is you, 2 barber surgeons with minimal formal training, and a man from Burgundy whose primary qualification appears to be that he was willing to show up. The municipality is not being selective. It is being desperate. The distinction will matter later, when you start comparing notes with the Burgundian and realize that his approach to treatment is essentially identical to yours and that neither of you is doing significantly better than the other, which tells you something important about how much the formal training is actually worth out here. Your first real patient is a tanner named Bernard. He comes to you walking, which already makes him exceptional among what you will see over the coming months. He holds his left arm slightly away from his body because under his armpit there is a swelling the size of a large egg, hard, hot, and painful enough that even the friction of his sleeve makes him flinch. He has a fever, the look of a candle burning too fast. You examine him from a distance, using a long wooden staff to move his collar and lift his sleeve without touching him. You wear waxed linen gloves, a mask soaked in vinegar and packed with rosemary, camphor, and cloves, a barrier against bad air. The theory is called miasma. Illness rises from rot and corruption in the air, enters the body through the breath, and upsets the 4 humors that keep a person alive. It is not superstition. It is the best science the 14th century has produced, and you believe it the way you believe in arithmetic. You bleed Bernard, apply a poultice, prescribe a purging draught, and tell him to rest. He calls you master and goes home. He is dead in 4 days. You find out from his neighbor, a broad woman named Marguerite, who delivers the news as though she expects you to fix it retroactively. You stand in her doorway and feel something medical school did not prepare you to feel. Grief and professional failure arriving at exactly the same time. Bernard was your patient. You gave him your best, and your best was Galen and vinegar and a poultice. And Bernard is dead. The medical faculty of the University of Paris, the greatest physicians in the Western world, had attributed the entire epidemic to a triple conjunction of Saturn, Jupiter, and Mars in 1345. This was not a fringe position. It was the official scientific consensus of the most prestigious institution in Europe. and it is completely, catastrophically useless at the bedside of a man turning black in front of you. You go home, sit with that for a while, open your notebooks, and start again. The days develop a structure, which is the thing that saves you, not medically, but mentally. You rise before dawn, prepare your mask and gloves and staff, check the municipal list of households, and go to work. The city is different now in ways you've stopped noticing individually. The bells ring more than they used to. The gravediggers, a group of men for whom you have developed a deep, wordless professional respect, move through the streets at hours when no one else is outdoors. Market stalls sit empty 3 days a week. Dogs have found things in alleys they should not have found. You move through the streets with a handbell, which you ring to announce your presence so people can clear the road. This is a contractual requirement. And also, if you're being honest, somewhat undignified for a man with a university education. A woman you pass every morning presses herself against the wall when she hears you coming, clutching a small bunch of herbs to her nose. You have considered telling her that her herbs are nowhere near as good as yours. You have decided against it. You cannot eat at a tavern, sit in church, or stand in the market. You eat alone, sleep badly, write your notes by candlelight, and then get up and do it again. The municipality has also prohibited you from treating anyone who does not have plague. Your contract is exclusive, your time entirely belonging to the epidemic. This means that somewhere in the city there are people with broken bones, infected wounds, difficult births, and ordinary fevers who cannot get a physician because the physician is busy with the thing that is killing everyone. You think about this sometimes at the table after writing, and there is no resolution to think toward, so eventually you stop thinking about it and go to sleep. In September, you are called to a house in the Weaver's Quarter. The father is 2 days dead, and the mother is in the late progression, fever high, the bubo in her neck already darkening, her breath telling you everything you need to know about the next 48 hours. Sitting in the corner are 3 children. The oldest is a girl of perhaps 9. She watches you examine her mother with the careful attention of someone taking notes. When you finish, she asks, without any particular emotion, the voice of a child who has already cried through the emotion and come out the other side, whether her mother is going to recover. You have learned not to lie, not because you are noble, but because the lie collapses eventually, and when it does, the person is worse off for it. You tell the girl her mother is very sick and that you will come back tomorrow. She nods once, the way a person nods when they've already understood the real answer. She is 9 years old, she has been running this household alone for days, and she is looking at you with the expression of someone who needs to know where the children will go, not whether the medicine will work. You arrange for a neighbor to take the children. You come back the following morning. The mother has died in the night. You write her name, the date, and plague as the cause. The entry takes 30 seconds. You have written it, with different names, more than 200 times. You begin lancing the buboes. It is not your first instinct, but you have watched enough patients to notice something Galen never mentioned. The ones who occasionally survive tend to be the ones whose swellings drain. You don't know why. The explanation belongs to a century 500 years away. But you've seen it happen enough times that you follow the pattern, even though the theory doesn't support it, because the theory has not saved anyone you can name. The first patient you lance who survives is a blacksmith named Henry, 40 years old, built like a door. His fever breaks on the 3rd morning. He sits up and asks for bread. You stand at the foot of his bed trying to look like this was exactly what you expected. Henri, who has the instincts of a man who has watched other men pretend to know things they don't, looks at you and says, "You weren't sure that was going to work, were you?" It is not entirely a question. You tell him to rest for another week. You lance more buboes after that. Some patients survive. Most don't. But the ratio is better than anything else you're doing. And better than anything else is right now the closest thing you have to medicine. You also begin performing autopsies in a converted storeroom. Vinegar-soaked rags burning at each corner, the smoke mixing with everything else into something you eventually stop trying to describe. You open bodies. You find enlarged lymph nodes, blackened spleen, hemorrhage tissue throughout. The disease written plainly in the organs of the dead in a language you don't yet have the vocabulary to read. You write it down in precise detail and understand almost none of it in terms that would help the next patient. But you write it down anyway, because it is the only honest thing you can do with what you're seeing. It is during these sessions that you begin to quietly notice what your theory cannot explain. The disease does not spread the way bad air should spread. Air does not stay on one side of a street. Air does not travel with a family from house to house, while skipping their neighbors entirely. The pattern you are watching, if you read your notes carefully enough, late at night when the day's work is done, looks less like corrupted wind, and more like something moving between people directly. You write this observation down with more hedging than anything else in your notebooks, framed carefully enough that no one could accuse you of contradicting Galen outright. Then you quietly start recommending that households with sick members keep their doors and windows closed and avoid contact with neighbors, which is the opposite of the standard advice, and which you justify to anyone who asks, on grounds that are technically within the acceptable theory while being driven by something else entirely. Several of the households that follow this instruction fare better than those that don't. You add this to the notes. You keep your conclusions to yourself. By October, the flagellants come through. You hear them before you see them. A rhythmic sound that resolves as you turn a corner into 60 men moving in slow procession through the street, shirtless in the autumn cold, beating themselves across the back with leather straps fitted with iron spikes. Some have been walking town to town for weeks. Their backs show it. They believe the plague is God's punishment for human sin, and that enough public penance will cause him to relent. You stand in a doorway and watch them pass. What you feel is not quite contempt and not quite pity, but something in the uncomfortable space between them, because you understand the impulse. You have spent 4 months trying everything you know and watching people die anyway, and the difference between their response to that failure and yours is mostly a matter of professional training. They flagellate. You lance buboes and write in notebooks and try to appear confident. The outcomes are, if you're being honest with yourself, comparable. What you notice in the weeks after they pass through is that the plague seems to follow their route, new clusters appearing in the towns they visited, in the time frame you'd expect if something was traveling with them. You write this in your notes with 4 separate layers of hedging, because you have no framework that explains it and you do not want to be wrong in writing, only in practice. What you do not write down, because it is not your place to say, and because you are trying to keep your contract, is what you observed at the edges of the procession. People reaching out to touch the flagellants as they passed, pressing forward to receive what they believed was transmitted holiness, a blessing by proximity to suffering. In the same weeks that you have been quietly telling households to keep their distance from the sick, the flagellants are moving through the same streets inviting the opposite. You think about this at night. You think about it for a long time. In November, you are at the house of a cloth merchant named Gaston. His wife, Isabel, follows you from room to room asking questions you cannot answer. When you finish examining him and begin preparing your instruments, she grabs your arm and asks you directly, "Is this how her husband is going to die?" You tell her Gaston is very sick, that you'll do everything available to you, and that the next 2 days will tell you more than you can say right now. She releases your arm and nods. Then she says, with a practicality that is both heartbreaking and admirable, "Tell me what he'll need if he survives, and what I'll need to do if he doesn't." You tell her both things. On the 3rd morning, Gaston's fever has broken and he is sitting up, pale and irritable, which is in your experience an excellent sign. You tell him to rest for 2 more weeks. He immediately begins to object. You leave before he finishes the sentence. In December, you get sick. It starts as a fever, which you recognize with the dread of a man who has watched fever become something worse approximately 300 times. You go home and close the door and bleed yourself, not because you think it will work, but because it is the ritual that says you are still a physician acting on a patient, rather than just a sick man lying in a bed. You sweat through your bedding for 3 nights and lie there thinking, with a strange calm, about your notebooks, whether anyone will read them, whether the observations will survive even if you don't. On the 4th morning, the fever breaks. You sit up, eat something, and sit at the table for a long time in the specific, dazed gratitude of a person who has just realized they're going to continue. Then you pick up your bell and your staff and go back to work, because there is always more work. By spring, the acute phase has passed. The municipality releases you from your contract on a Thursday morning. The official shakes your hand, pays you the final installment of your salary, and thanks you in the slightly formal way people thank someone for doing something they themselves would not have done. You go home and open your notebooks from the beginning. 312 patients, every observation across 8 months of work that your training barely prepared you for. The pattern is clearer now than it was during the doing of it. Who lived, who didn't, and what the difference was insofar as anything in your power accounted for that difference. The proximity observations, the quarantine recommendations, the drainage records, the autopsies. You write a summary, careful and hedged, wrapped in the acceptable language of your day, but with the observations intact for anyone who wants to read them that way. Because observations are what you have now, and observations are what you trust more than anything Montpellier taught you. Your theories were wrong, built on what was knowable at the time, collapsing when they met something the knowable couldn't contain. But the looking was right. The writing was right. The refusal to stop observing even when the observation didn't fit the framework, that was right. 2 centuries from now, A man named Vesalius will open bodies and be celebrated as a revolutionary in understanding human anatomy. He will be working, partly, from notes made by men who did exactly what you did in that storeroom, opened bodies in a crisis and wrote down what they found. He will not mention that. History rarely circles back to thank the people who were there first. The plague will return, as it turns out. It comes back in 1360, again in 1374, and periodically for the next 3 centuries, one of history's most committed encores. The world you are walking back into is not the world that existed before the summer of 1348, and it is not going to recover the shape it had. The population of France will not return to what it was for another 150 years. But somewhere in the wreckage, in the notebooks of men who walked plague streets with bells and vinegar-soaked masks, who followed the pattern where it led even when the theory said otherwise, something is being assembled that will eventually become the thing that actually saves people. Not Galen. Not the conjunction of planets. The willingness to look at what is actually happening and write it down accurately, even when everything you were taught is pointing somewhere else. You didn't know that's what you were building. You were just a physician in a waxed coat, walking a dying city with a bell in your hand and a notebook in your bag, trying to figure out why some people lived. As it turns out, that was enough. That's a wrap. The plague doctors were real, the medicine was exactly as limited as described, and a French physician named Guy de Chauliac, personal doctor to Pope Clement VI in Avignon, genuinely did contract plague in 1348, treat himself, survive, and later write about the catastrophe with striking candor, including the admission that most of what he and his colleagues did was, in his own words, of little avail. The beaked mask, for the record, was designed in 1619, about 270 years after the Black Death, which means the most iconic image of plague medicine came long after the worst plague was already history. If this one made you think, leave a comment. Subscribe for more. See you in the next one.